I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 23, so let's focus on verses 32 and 33. For I will place the inhabitants of the land under your control, and you will drive them out ahead of you. And you must not make a covenant with them or their gods. They must not remain in your land, or else they will make you sin against me. If you worship their gods, it will be a snare for you. You see, these verses have all three components of salvation and victorious living. They have grace and works and faith. Now, this passage might be viewed as a metaphor for personal salvation, with our bodies, let's say, representing the land. After all, Genesis 2, verse 7 says that we were all just a handful of dirt and the breath of God. So these former inhabitants of our land, right, represent the sinful ways that used to control us. Israel represents us, that is, our souls delivered. And then the idols or the gods or those fake gods or those goals that our sin nature used to pursue. So grace is the system that God allows whereby mankind can be saved through faith. Instead of being perfect in righteousness, which is impossible for us, we have grace. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 is very clear. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Deliverance, aka salvation, through man's faithful belief in God, well, that is His gift. That is His grace toward us. Otherwise, our righteousness would be weighed purely against the virtue of our works. And the Bible is very clear that God's standard of perfect holiness cannot be met by sinful men. Consider Romans chapter 3, verse 23. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So apart from God's grace, once again, it is impossible for us to do enough good works in order to earn salvation. Why? Because number one, we're sinners, so we're imperfect, but God's standard is perfect holiness. Well, that's a problem. Anybody who wants to be saved, that is a problem. You see, God's grace was displayed in today's passage by His placing of Israel in control of the former inhabitants. Accepting God's grace means that we fully believe God's righteousness has delivered us and not our works. And sometimes, even before the deliverance occurs, we have to have the faith that if God says He will deliver, then He will. And even though former inhabitants may still be present in your life, God promises to go before us and drive them out in proportion to your faithful willingness to go fight. We can see that again in Romans chapter 6, verse 23. So faith is saving knowledge of the unseen based on God's word. Let me say it again. Faith is the evidence of things unseen. And what is unseen? The deliverance of the Lord. So faith meant that Israel had to trust God in unknown lands and against unknown nations, and the idols that those nations worshiped. So Israel's willingness to drive out the former inhabitants would only be to the extent that Israel had faith in God's promise. So do you believe God's promise of salvation for you to the extent that you would turn from your sin in faith? You see, after we have received salvation, then we do the works of God. We do the things which He tells us to do. The works come after the faith and not before. So have you continued to discipline yourself to seek God's word and to believe it? Putting your faith into action is what drives out former inhabitants. It's one thing to say, oh, I wish I wasn't the person I've always been. But what are you doing to faithfully believe God's word and to live victoriously and to drive out those former inhabitants? Well, continue working hard against the will of your flesh in order to put to death all the goals and the motivations that seek to intimidate you to abandon faith in God. You see, we are not saved by faith and our works. By God's grace, we are saved through faith that leads to works. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Check us out at groundworksministries.com.